It was a cold, gloomy weekend in late October when I decided I needed to get away from the city. My friend had recently bought an old cabin in the woods and kept telling me how peaceful it was. I needed peace. Work had been a grind, and I felt like I was on the edge of a breakdown. The drive to the cabin was long and winding, taking me deeper and deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisting together overhead to form a dark tunnel. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked just as old and worn as my friend had said. It stood alone, surrounded by thick woods, its wooden walls weathered and gray. Inside, the cabin was simple. There was a small kitchen, a living room with a fireplace, and a single bedroom. I unpacked my bag, lit a fire, and settled in for a quiet evening. The silence was almost too much after the constant noise of the city, but it was a welcome change. I made myself some tea and sat by the fire, feeling the tension slowly go away. As the night went on, I decided to go to bed early. I hadn't slept well in weeks, and the idea of a full night's rest was too tempting to resist. I climbed into the old, creaky bed and was soon fast asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it got louder. It sounded like footsteps, slow and careful, moving around the cabin. My heart pounded as I lay still, trying to hear. The footsteps stopped, then started again, this time closer to the front door. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard the doorknob rattle. I froze, my mind racing. Who would be out here at this hour? My friend had said the nearest neighbor was miles away. The rattling stopped, and for a moment, there was silence again. Then, the door creaked open. I cursed myself for not locking it. I heard the footsteps enter the cabin, moving slowly and deliberately. I lay perfectly still, my breath shallow and quiet. The footsteps came closer, and I could hear the floorboards creaking under the weight of the intruder. They were in the living room now, moving towards the bedroom. Panic surged through me. I needed to hide. Slowly, I slid out of bed and crawled under it, pressing myself against the wall. The bedroom door opened with a soft creak, and the footsteps got louder. I could see the shadow of the intruder moving across the floor. They were searching the room, their movements careful and slow. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't look under the bed. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, the footsteps retreated, moving back towards the living room. I heard the door open again, then close. Silence returned, but I didn't move. I lay under the bed for what felt like forever, listening for any sound, any hint that they might come back. Eventually, I gathered the courage to crawl out and check the cabin. It was empty. The intruder was gone. I locked the door this time and sat by the fire, clutching a kitchen knife. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I packed my things and left the cabin, promising myself never to return. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. The peace I had wanted in the woods was shattered, replaced by a lingering fear that would stay with me long after I got back to the city. That night, back in my apartment, I tried to sleep, but every creak and rustle made me jump. I couldn't help but wonder who or what had been out there in the woods. Just as I was drifting off, I heard a faint rustling outside my window, the same sound that had woken me at the cabin. My heart raced as I remembered the footsteps, the rattling doorknob. I realized then that the fear hadn't stayed in the woods. It had followed me home. The storm hit suddenly. I was already on edge, having rented this cabin deep in the woods to get away from everything. But instead of peace, I got a storm with howling wind and rain slamming against the windows. It started with a knock. At first, I thought it was just the storm making strange noises. But the knocking kept getting louder and more urgent. I looked through the peephole but saw only darkness. I told myself it was probably a branch hitting the door, but something didn't feel right. As the night dragged on, the knocking came and went. Sometimes it was at the front door, sometimes at the back. I tried to stay calm, thinking it was maybe just a prank or some animal. I decided to make coffee to help calm my nerves. The power went out. My heart raced as I tried to keep my hands steady. That's when I heard it, the sound of metal scraping, like someone trying to unlock the door. I froze. The locks were old, and not very strong. I had to do something. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and a kitchen knife. The flashlight cut through the darkness as I checked the locks and looked outside, seeing only shadows and the pouring rain. I was about to relax when I noticed fresh muddied boot prints leading from the back door to the edge of the woods. I hadn't seen them before. I locked the door and thought about calling the police but hesitated. With the storm, it would be hard for them to get here quickly. The knocking was constant now, so I decided to wait and see if it stopped. The hours dragged on. I was exhausted and jumpy, my nerves frayed by the endless knocking and the storm. Just before dawn, the knocking stopped suddenly. The cabin was filled with a creepy silence. I took a chance and looked outside. The rain had slowed, and a little bit of morning light was coming through the clouds. I saw a man standing near the edge of the woods. He was soaked and holding a flashlight. He looked worn out and strange, and there was something unsettling about him. I stayed hidden but watched as he walked back into the woods, disappearing from view. I checked all the doors and windows again to make sure they were secure. The power was still out, and everything was a mess from the storm. Later, when I finally had my phone working, I found out there had been a local man missing for days. He had been in the area, and the police were searching for him. It was clear now that he had been trying to find shelter or help, but his desperate attempts to get inside the cabin left me terrified. As I left the cabin, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold weather. The storm had passed, but I had a sinking feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, thinking about the man in the woods. I never found out what happened to him, but I knew I would never feel safe alone in that cabin again. The experience made me realize how quickly safety can turn into something much darker, and how thin the line is between peace and danger. The old cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect getaway. It was remote, surrounded by tall pine trees and thick fog that rolled in every evening. I rented it for the weekend, needing some quiet after a crazy month. As I drove up the winding dirt road, the cabin came into view: old wooden walls, a sagging porch, and a crooked chimney that promised warmth. The first night was calm. I lit a fire in the old stone fireplace and settled into a worn armchair with a book. The wind howled outside, but inside, the warmth and flicker of the flames felt cozy. The second night, things started to get weird. I woke up around midnight to a faint tapping on the windows. At first, I thought it was just a branch moving in the wind. But when I checked, I saw no branches near the windows. I told myself it was just my imagination. The next day, I decided to explore the nearby woods. The forest was unnervingly quiet, with no birds or rustling leaves. I found a small clearing with a few old, broken-down vehicles half buried in the undergrowth. They looked like they'd been there for decades. As I looked them over, I had the unsettling feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced around but saw nothing. Back at the cabin, the tapping on the windows started up again, but this time it was louder and more insistent, like someone was trying to get my attention. I pulled the curtains shut and tried to ignore it. Later that night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I heard footsteps outside the cabin. They were slow and steady, like someone was pacing back and forth. My heart raced as I listened to the footsteps getting closer to the door. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and went outside to check. The porch light flickered, and I saw nothing. The area around the cabin was empty, the ground untouched. Fear set in when I noticed small, muddy footprints leading up to the porch. They were too small to be from an adult but large enough to be from someone. I locked all the doors and windows, making sure they were secure. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, I decided to pack up and leave early the next morning. I barely slept, my eyes darting around the dark room every time I heard a noise. Just before dawn, I loaded up my car and got ready to leave. Before driving away, I took one last look around. The tapping had stopped, and the footsteps were gone. But when I checked the door handle, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a small, muddy handprint smeared on the glass, right at eye level. It was as if someone had been standing outside, watching me through the window, trying to get in. I drove away quickly, the cabin disappearing behind me as I made my way down the winding road. I never rented a cabin in the woods again. As I got further from the cabin, I noticed something strange on the road, a small, muddy footprint following my tire tracks. It was clear and fresh, and it was heading in the same direction I was driving. It made me shiver to think that whatever was out there had followed me, and now it knew exactly where I was headed. The silence that followed me home felt suffocating, and I couldn't escape the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I always loved the idea of spending a weekend alone in a cabin. When I found one to rent deep in the woods, I jumped at the chance. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a break from my busy life in the city. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows over the gravel driveway. The cabin was small but cozy. It had a fireplace, a little kitchen, and a loft bedroom. I unpacked my things, made a quick dinner, and settled in for the night with a book. At first, the quiet was nice. I could hear the wind moving through the trees and an owl hooting in the distance. As the night went on, the quiet started to feel creepy. Every creak of the cabin sounded louder in the silence. I kept telling myself it was just the old wood settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I went to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would help. I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise outside. It sounded like something heavy moving through the bushes. I got out of bed and looked out the window. In the dim moonlight, I could just make out a figure near the trees. It was too dark to see clearly, but it looked like a man. I told myself it was probably just a hiker or a hunter, someone who had gotten lost. But the figure didn't move, and the longer I watched, the more scared I felt. I forced myself to go back to bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child. The next day, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I decided to go for a walk to clear my mind. The woods were beautiful in the daylight, and I started to feel a bit silly for being so scared the night before. But as I walked, I found tracks in the dirt, leading away from the cabin. They were human tracks, deep and fresh. I followed them for a while, but they veered off into a thicker part of the woods. I decided to turn back, not wanting to get lost. When I got back to the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a footprint on the porch, just outside the door. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept the lights on and a knife by my bed. Around midnight, I heard the noise again. This time, it was closer, right outside the window. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept to the window and looked out. The figure was back, standing just a few feet away. I could see him clearly now, a man with a scraggly beard and dirty clothes. He was staring right at me. I panicked, grabbing my phone to call for help. But there was no signal. I was alone. I decided to confront him, grabbing the knife and opening the door. But when I stepped outside, he was gone. I stood there, knife in hand, my breath coming in short gasps, feeling both foolish and terrified. The next morning, I packed up and left as quickly as I could. I never looked back. I reported the incident to the rental agency, but they said no one had ever had any problems there before. Maybe it was just a drifter passing through, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something terrible. Back in the city, I tried to put the weekend behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I hear noises outside my window. When I look out, I swear I see that same figure, standing just a few feet away, staring at me. I moved to get away from him, but what if he followed me? What if he's still out there, watching and waiting? I decided to spend a weekend camping in the forest to escape the busy city. The first day went well. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and enjoyed the peace and quiet of nature. By nightfall, the crackling fire and the distant hooting of owls made me feel relaxed. The next morning, I woke up early and went for a hike. The trail was beautiful, with sunlight shining through the trees and birds singing. But as the day went on, dark clouds started to gather. I decided to head back to camp to avoid getting caught in the rain. By the time I got back, it had started to drizzle. I quickly gathered my things and put them inside the tent. The rain soon turned into a heavy downpour. I huddled inside, listening to the heavy drops hitting the tent. It was then that I noticed a strange sound, a rustling, too close to my tent to be just the wind or rain. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my nerves. But the rustling grew louder and more constant. I peeked out of the tent's flap and saw nothing but dark shapes and shadows. My mind raced, thinking of wild animals or, worse, a person lurking out there. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside, moving the beam across the campsite. Nothing. Just trees and the endless rain. But the sound continued, now seeming to move around me. My heart pounded as I realized it was no longer just rustling. It was the sound of someone, or something, moving through the bushes. I decided to get out of the tent and check it out. I walked carefully, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the rain. My footsteps were almost silent on the wet ground. Suddenly, I saw a figure crouching near my food supply. It was a man, drenched, trying to steal my food. He looked just as scared as I was when our eyes met. He stumbled back, mumbling something I couldn't hear over the rain. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm. Seeing he wasn't a threat, and was probably just as desperate as I was, I signaled for him to come closer. We both took shelter under a nearby tree, where the rain wasn't as heavy. I gave him some food and water, and we sat there in silence, listening to the rain. Eventually, the rain stopped, and the man, after thanking me, disappeared back into the forest. I never found out who he was or why he was out there, but I was glad the encounter ended peacefully. I packed up my things the next morning and left the campsite, feeling a strange mix of fear and relief. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees seemed to close in around me, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. When I finally reached the car, I breathed a sigh of relief and drove away, promising myself I wouldn't camp alone again. Weeks later, I read a news report about a missing person last seen in the same forest. The description matched the man I had seen. They never found him. Now, every time I close my eyes, I see his face, and I wonder if he ever really left the forest, or if something else found him first. I decided to spend the weekend at a cabin in the woods. It was supposed to be a peaceful break from the city. The cabin was small but cozy, with a tiny kitchen, a living area, and a bedroom. There was no cell service, which was fine by me. I wanted to unplug. The first night was quiet. I spent the evening reading and went to bed early. The silence of the forest was nice. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to explore the area. The woods were thick, but there were paths that made it easy to walk around. I walked for hours, enjoying the fresh air and the sounds of nature. When I got back to the cabin, something felt off. The door was slightly open, which was strange because I was sure I had locked it. I went inside and looked around. Nothing seemed to be missing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I checked the windows and the back door. All were locked. The second night was different. As I lay in bed, I heard noises outside. At first, I thought it was just animals, but then I heard what sounded like footsteps on the porch. I froze, listening closely. The footsteps stopped, and then there was a soft knocking on the door. I stayed still, my heart racing. The knocking went on for what felt like hours but was probably just minutes. Eventually, it stopped. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I found footprints around the cabin. They were human, but there were no other signs of who had been there. I decided to end my trip early. I packed my things quickly and left the cabin. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I was relieved when I finally reached the main road and saw other cars. When I got home, I tried to forget about the experience. But a few days later, I found a note slipped under my apartment door. It was a single piece of paper with one sentence. I know where you live. I moved out of the city the next month, changed my number, and never went back to that cabin. The fear stayed with me, a reminder that some places are better left alone. Months later, I was settling into my new home. The fear had started to fade, and I felt almost normal again. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a knock on the door. My heart stopped. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. No one was there. I opened the door slowly and found another note on the floor. This one simply said, "You can't hide." It was late October, and my friends and I decided to go camping deep in the woods for the weekend. We found a quiet spot far from any trails, perfect for getting away from the noise of the city. The first night was calm. We sat around the campfire, shared stories, and enjoyed the cool autumn air. The next day, we walked through the forest, looking around. As the sun began to set, we headed back to our campsite. I noticed a strange silence in the air. No birds, no rustling leaves, just quiet. It was creepy, but I ignored it. That night, as we sat around the fire again, the quiet grew even more intense. The flickering flames seemed to cast spooky shadows that danced on the trees. We decided to go to bed early. I climbed into my tent, but sleep wouldn't come easily. I kept hearing faint noises outside, like twigs snapping and leaves crunching. My mind raced with thoughts of animals or, worse, people hiding in the darkness. Around midnight, I heard a distinct rustling sound, closer this time. My heart pounded in my chest. I lay still, straining to hear. Then, a low, growling sound echoed through the night. It was close, too close. I could barely breathe. My hand fumbled for the flashlight beside me. I clicked it on and pointed it at the tent's entrance. The growling stopped. I waited, flashlight in hand, for what felt like forever. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The fire had died down, and the campsite was covered in darkness. I scanned the area with my flashlight but saw nothing unusual. My heart rate began to slow, and I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the woods. I jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight. I knew I had to wake my friends. I scrambled out of the tent and rushed to the others, shaking them awake. We gathered by the fire pit, whispering about what to do. One of my friends suggested it was probably just an animal, but none of us wanted to check. We built the fire back up, hoping the light would keep whatever was out there away. None of us slept that night. We sat around the fire, alert and on edge, until the first light of dawn began to break through the trees. The feeling of relief was real as the sun rose, pushing away the shadows and fears of the night. We packed up our campsite quickly, eager to leave the woods behind. As we walked back to our car, we noticed deep claw marks on a tree near our site, too large to be from any animal around here. It sent chills down my spine. We didn't talk much on the way back, each of us lost in our thoughts. I still go camping, but I'm more careful now. That experience taught me to respect the wild and the unknown. Sometimes, the scariest things are not ghosts or monsters but the things we can't explain that remind us how small and weak we are in the big picture of nature. That weekend left a lasting mark on me, a reminder of how close we can come to danger without even knowing it. Every time I hear a twig snap in the woods now, I wonder if it's out there, watching, waiting for the next time I let my guard down.